It happened long before Morty was even born. One of those nights Rick never really talked about, except in hints and sideways glances. He had been walking alone on a narrow stretch of land that wasn't quite a planet and wasn't quite a moon, a place so small and quiet that even the nearby stars seemed to speak in whispers. The ground was pale grey and soft, as if it had been sifted through the fingers of some ancient hand. Rick had his hands in the deep pockets of his lab coat, shoulders hunched against a chill that wasn't really there. His ship waited behind him, humming faintly, a sound so low it could have been mistaken for his own pulse. He stood still for a long time, looking out across a horizon that seemed impossibly far away for a place so small. Then, and this is the part he never told anyone, the stars looked back. It wasn't like they moved or blinked or did anything dramatic. They just noticed him. That was enough. The feeling was so strange it made his chest tighten, not in fear, but in the way you feel when someone remembers your name after years apart. There was warmth in it, and weight. And yet, even in that strange connection, Rick sensed the first thread of something loosening, a thread tied to his name, his work, his very existence. Somewhere out there, the great machinery of reality had begun the slow, patient work of erasing him. Not with malice, but with the inevitability of sand smoothing away footprints. He lit a cigarette and took one long drag, letting the smoke drift upward toward those watching stars. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "Guess we're doing this." His voice sounded too small in the open air. Later, when Morty was older, Rick would sit in the garage with a beer in hand and say, "There was a night when the sky knew who I was." Morty would laugh, thinking it was just another one of Rick's rambling stories. But Rick never laughed with him. He'd just stare into the dark like he was listening for something that never came back. And maybe the stars were still out there, waiting to meet his eyes again. The earliest memory Morty had of Rick wasn't one of adventure or chaos or danger. It wasn't even of words. It was silence. He was 6 years old, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor of the garage. The air smelled faintly of metal, solder, and something sweeter, the cocoa cooling in his hands. Rick was a few feet away, bent over a half-built machine that pulsed softly with a blue-green glow. Every so often he'd tap something with a screwdriver, or lean in close as if listening to a heartbeat no one else could hear. Morty didn't speak. He didn't have to. There was a rhythm in the stillness between them, the low hum of the device mingling with the occasional creak of the garage walls. Rick didn't look up, but Morty noticed the way his head tilted slightly toward him, as if making sure the boy was still there. It was the kind of attention that didn't need eye contact. The cocoa was warm enough to hold, but cool enough to sip. Each swallow felt like it filled more than just Morty's stomach. It spread out into his chest, into the quiet space between his ribs. He wondered if Rick felt it too, some shared warmth that required no explanation. Outside, the world was still waking up. Morty could hear the faint hiss of sprinklers down the street, the distant thump of someone closing a car door. But in the garage, time felt thick and unhurried. The light through the window was soft and golden, making dust motes drift like tiny planets between them. Rick didn't finish the machine that day. In fact, Morty couldn't remember if he ever saw it again. But the feeling stayed, the sense that not all important moments needed action or answers. Sometimes, the best thing was to just sit near someone you loved, letting the silence speak for you. Years later, when Morty thought back to all the impossible worlds, all the strange dangers and miraculous escapes, this memory, this small, wordless afternoon, would come back first. The smell of cocoa, the hum of an unfinished invention, Rick's quiet presence like gravity, keeping him still in a universe that never stopped moving. And maybe that was the beginning, though neither of them knew it, the first thread in a bond that would stretch across galaxies, and through the parts of life that couldn't be fixed with science or escape with a portal gun. It began as small things, so small that Rick almost ignored them. A spaceport clerk in the Andromeda Fringe, who should have owed him a favor, stared blankly when Rick gave his name. A marketplace on the floating city of Vereen sold his old designs as antique curiosities, without a hint of recognition. On one dusty asteroid he found a plaque outside a rusting machine, a portal stabilizer he had built decades ago, labeled Origin Unknown. At first, Rick told himself it didn't matter. The universe was full of people who didn't know him. He preferred it that way. But it was different when the people who should remember him didn't. Morty noticed before Rick admitted it out loud. They were on a quiet refueling stop, sitting on the ship's wing and eating cheap sandwiches from a vending machine that didn't even bother to toast the bread. Morty asked, "Hey, why didn't that guy in the docking bay know who you were? You've been here before, right?" Rick shrugged, chewing. "People forget. Places change. Nothing lasts forever, Morty." But Morty caught the flicker in his eyes. Quick, almost hidden, like the moment a star dims before vanishing from sight. Later, in the pilot's seat, Rick stared at an old star map stored in the ship's computer. Half the markings had faded, tiny pinpricks of light missing from the routes he once travelled. He tapped the screen gently, as though touching them could bring them back. It didn't. That night, parked in the quiet shadow of a moon, Rick lay back in his chair with a bottle in his hand, staring at the unfamiliar constellations. He thought about footprints, how they last just long enough for wind or water to erase them, and he wondered, without saying it aloud, if his own were already gone. Morty, in the back of the ship, hummed a song Rick didn't recognize. Or maybe he did once, and had already forgotten. They found it by accident, drifting through an unfamiliar stretch of space where the stars seemed closer together, as if huddling for warmth. The planet below was wrapped in soft blue clouds that glowed faintly from within, like lanterns seen through fog. Rick landed them in a meadow of long silver grass. The blades swayed, though there was no wind, at least none Morty could feel, and then he heard it. A song. It was low and steady, a deep tone that rose and fell with the rhythm of a breath. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, the ground, the air, even the distant mountains. There were no words, just a sound that felt like someone's hand resting lightly on your shoulder. Morty looked over at Rick, who was standing still, eyes half-lidded. "You've been here before?" Morty asked. Rick nodded once slowly. "Yeah, long time ago." Did it always do this?" "Always." Morty waited for more, but Rick's gaze was fixed far away, like he was listening for something hidden inside the song. They spent the afternoon wandering. The silver grass brushed against their knees, and now and then tiny specks of light would float up from the ground, carried by the invisible current of the lullaby. Morty reached out and caught one. It dissolved instantly against his palm, leaving behind a faint warmth. As the sky darkened, the song deepened. It didn't get louder, but heavier somehow, settling into Morty's chest like a stone he didn't mind carrying. When they finally returned to the ship, Morty kept humming a fragment of the melody under his breath without realizing it. Rick didn't tell him that he'd done the same, decades ago, and that the tune had never quite left him, though somewhere along the way he'd stopped remembering where it came from. They were drifting in slow orbit around a caramel-coloured gas giant, the kind of planet that looked like it had been painted in lazy, swirling strokes. From up close, the clouds moved like cream stirred into coffee, folding and unfolding in patterns that never repeated. Rick had set the ship to idle, no hurry, no destination. Just the quiet hum of the systems and the gentle pull of the planet's gravity. He rummaged through a small crate in the galley and pulled out ingredients Morty had never seen before. Slices of bread tinted a faint, otherworldly blue, a jar of some translucent fruit preserve that shimmered like morning dew, and a soft wedge of pale cheese that gave off a faint, sweet scent. What is that?" Morty asked, watching as Rick began to assemble the sandwich. Rick didn't look up. "Old recipe. Haven't made it in years." He spread the preserve in a slow, deliberate motion, then layered the cheese in thin, careful slices. Some things you forget. Some things you remember exactly. Morty took the sandwich when Rick handed it over. The bread was warm, and when he bit into it, the flavors unfolded like a story. First the sweetness, then the softness, and finally a strange, airy aftertaste that made him feel like he was lighter than before. They ate on the small observation deck, feet propped against the glass, staring down at the swirling planet below. "So, about that thing," Morty began, "where people don't remember you." Rick didn't respond right away. He chewed, swallowed and looked out into the clouds. "Eat your sandwich, Morty. It's perfect right now." Morty wanted to press, but something about the way Rick said it made him stop. For a while, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, chewing slowly, watching the gas giant turn. Somewhere deep below, storms larger than continents churned in absolute silence. When the sandwiches were gone, Rick brushed the crumbs from his coat and leaned back, eyes half closed. Morty thought he might be asleep, but then Rick said, almost too quietly to hear, "Sometimes, kid, you gotta hold on to the small stuff. The big stuff slips away." They stopped at a dim-lit station on the edge of a trade route Rick hadn't used in decades. It was the kind of place that smelled faintly of engine oil and fried food, where the walls hummed with old wiring, and the air felt heavy from too many years without a fresh breeze. Rick led Morty into a bar tucked in the corner of the station's lower deck. The sign outside flickered in pale yellow, half the letters burned out. Inside, a few patrons hunched over their drinks, the low murmur of conversation mixing with the soft clink of glass. Behind the counter stood a tall, wiry man with silver hair and a deep scar running from his temple to his jaw. His eyes lit briefly when he saw Rick approach, but only with the polite welcome reserved for strangers. Rick ordered without using his name. The man poured the drink, set it down, and said, "First time seeing you here?" Rick's mouth curved in the smallest of smiles. "Yeah, guess so." They sat at a corner table. Morty leaned forward. "You know that guy, don't you?" Rick took a slow sip before answering. "Once. Saved his life on Calvex Prime. We rebuilt an entire defense grid together in under 12 hours. That was a long time ago." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Rick stared at his glass. The liquid caught the dim light, turning it a soft amber. "Because he doesn't remember. And if he doesn't remember, maybe it's better if I don't remind him." When the bartender passed their table again, Rick thanked him like it was their first meeting. The man nodded, smiling faintly, and moved on. For the rest of the evening, they talked about nothing important. Weather patterns on far-off moons, the price of Starship parts, the mediocre quality of the bar's fried noodles. Rick laughed more than Morty expected. It was the kind of laughter that sounded almost new, like he'd borrowed it for the night. When they finally left, Morty glanced back through the doorway. The bartender was wiping the counter, humming to himself. He didn't look up. Rick didn't either. It started on a rainy afternoon, the kind where the sky seemed too heavy to hold itself up. Morty sat in the garage, watching water bead along the window and slide down in slow, uncertain paths. Rick was out on one of his solo trips, the kind he never explained. The place felt too still without the usual clatter of tools and muttered swears. Morty wandered over to Rick's workbench. It was cluttered with the usual chaos, wires coiled like sleeping snakes, half-finished devices, a soldering iron that still smelled faintly of burnt metal. He didn't mean to build anything. At first he just started stacking a few pieces together, fitting shapes into shapes the way a child might arrange pebbles on a shore. But as the rain kept falling, an idea began to take shape. Something small. Something that could hold a sound and give it back later, exactly as it was. By evening he had it, a little silver box with a single round button. He pressed it, spoke his name softly into the air and let go. The box repeated it back to him in his own voice, perfect and clear. Morty tried it with other things. The sound of the rain, the creak of the garage chair, a short, awkward laugh he caught himself making. And then, hesitating, he remembered the way Rick's voice sounded when he said "good job" after Morty fixed a loose wire last week. Morty whispered the words himself, hoping it would sound the same. It didn't. When Rick came back, smelling faintly of cold air and engine oil, Morty showed him the box. "It's, just for fun," Morty said, suddenly embarrassed. Rick turned it over in his hands, studying it without comment. He pressed the button, listened to the rain, to Morty's voice, to that imperfect "good job." His face didn't change much, but there was a softness in his eyes when he set the box back down. "Not bad, kid," Rick said. And this time, Morty didn't have to record it. He knew he'd remember. They'd been drifting for days, following no particular route, when Rick brought the ship to a stop near what looked like an abandoned refueling satellite. It was small, unlit, and silent, just a dark shape against the pale shimmer of a nearby nebula. "Come on," Rick said, grabbing his coat. "You should see this." They floated down in the quiet of space, boots settling on metal that felt cold even through their suits. The place looked empty, stripped of anything useful long ago. But Rick moved with a kind of certainty, heading for a small panel set into one of the outer walls. It was a door, if you could call it that, just a seam in the metal, no handle, no markings. Rick checked his watch, and for a while they just stood there. The only sounds were the faint hiss of their breathing and the soft creak of the satellite's frame settling in the cold. Then, exactly as the minute hand struck 12, the seam split open. Warm light spilled out, and Morty stepped inside after Rick. The space beyond wasn't a room so much as a dream shaped into walls. It was a cafe, small and old-fashioned, with shelves of books in languages Morty didn't recognize, and the faint scent of coffee drifting in the air. No one was there, but 2 steaming mugs sat waiting on a table by the window. Morty took one. It was perfect. The right temperature, the right weight in his hands. He asked, "What is this place?" Rick sat down across from him. "Used to meet someone here, long time ago." "Who?" Rick didn't answer right away. He looked out at the nebula through the cafe's round window. "Can't remember." They stayed until the mugs were empty, and then the door opened again. When they stepped back into the cold of the satellite, Morty glanced over his shoulder. The cafe was gone. Only the blank wall remained. Back in the ship, Rick poured himself another drink. Morty thought about asking if they'd ever go back, but something told him not to. Some doors, he felt, were meant to open just once, even if you never understood why. It wasn't sudden. That was the strange part. The forgetting crept in like fog so gradually that Rick could almost convince himself it wasn't happening. A familiar planet's skyline missing its tallest tower. A marketplace where his old inventions were sold without his name. Old star routes disappearing from maps like threads pulled from a fabric. One afternoon, as they drifted through a quiet asteroid field, Morty asked about it directly. "Is this, like, the universe's memory getting worse, or just yours?" Rick leaned back in the pilot's seat, eyes half on the console, half on the empty black beyond. "Universe sheds its oldest stuff, Morty. Like trees dropping leaves. Makes room for the new." "But people don't do that, right?" Rick smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure they do. Every day. You just don't notice until something important's gone." They passed a small dying star. Its light was weak, stretched thin across the distance. Morty watched it until it disappeared behind them. He thought about how even a star, burning for billions of years, could fade so quietly. That night, Rick sat alone in the galley, a glass in front of him, and an old dog-eared notebook beside it. The pages were filled with sketches, coordinates, and small, unfinished sentences. Every so often he would pause and just stare at the words, as if trying to remember who had written them. When Morty came in for water, Rick closed the notebook without a sound. "Couldn't sleep?" Morty asked. Rick shrugged. "Just thinking." Morty nodded, but in the quiet he thought he heard something else. The sound of threads slowly loosening, the kind you can't tie back together once they've slipped apart. Summer found Rick in the garage one evening, tinkering with something small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. It looked like a watch, but it ticked too slowly, as if marking time for something larger than hours. She leaned against the doorway. "Can I ask you something?" Rick didn't look up. "You're already doing it. Are you scared of being forgotten?" The ticking filled the pause. Rick adjusted a tiny gear, turned the object over, and set it down without answering. "Because," Summer continued, "it's kind of obvious something's changing. With you, with the way people treat you, I don't know, it's like they don't remember," Rick finished for her. She nodded. Rick leaned back in his chair, eyes on the ceiling as though searching for something up there. "Summer, people remember what they want to remember. The rest fades. Doesn't mean it's bad, just means it's gone." "That doesn't sound like something you believe." A faint, crooked smile tugged at his mouth. "Maybe not." They didn't speak for a while. Summer wandered around the garage, pretending to look at the shelves, the tools, the scattered blueprints. Her eyes caught on a small black notebook sitting on the workbench, the one Rick never seemed to leave unattended. When she left, Rick waited until the door closed before opening it again. He wrote something down quickly, almost like catching a thought before it escaped. Then he closed the notebook, placed it gently beside the ticking device, and sat back. The garage was quiet except for the slow, steady sound of time moving forward. Rick guided Morty to a place that seemed almost impossibly quiet, a drifting structure in the void of space shaped like a spiraling tower. Its windows were tall and narrow, and the metal frame shimmered with an almost liquid silver glow. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and something faintly metallic, like the memory of electricity. Shelves stretched high above their heads, filled with books that had titles but no authors, manuscripts that seemed familiar and yet completely unknown. Morty ran his fingers along the spines, pausing at a book whose cover felt warm to the touch. "Have you been here before?" he asked, whispering, as if sound might disturb the quiet. Rick didn't answer immediately. He wandered deeper, tracing his hands over the books, eyes scanning lines of text that flickered and shifted when he looked directly at them. Finally, he stopped in front of a thin volume with a cover that was entirely blank. He picked it up carefully as though handling something fragile, and traced a finger over the smooth surface. "This one," he murmured almost to himself, "might have been me." Morty tilted his head. "You wrote a book?" Rick shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe it just remembers me differently. Doesn't matter. Stories aren't about who wrote them. They're about who remembers them." He set the book back gently. Morty thought he might close it with a sigh, but Rick simply walked away, letting the pages whisper in the faint, drifting light. They left the library soon after, stepping back into the cold of the void. Morty glanced down at the notebook he carried, the one full of their adventures, and felt a sudden weight of understanding. Memory wasn't always reliable, but sometimes, even if the universe forgot, small moments held carefully could last forever. Rick piloted the ship toward a world unlike any other, where the concept of a day seemed almost lazy. 3 moons hung in the sky, each moving at its own slow pace, casting overlapping shadows that stretched and folded across a meadow of tall golden grass. "This place," Morty whispered, leaning against the observation window. "Time feels weird here." Rick chuckled softly, not taking his eyes off the horizon. Weird, maybe. Peaceful, definitely. They stepped outside, and the air was soft, like it had been filtered through clouds for centuries. The grass bent under their feet without resistance, and the occasional breeze carried a lullaby so faint Morty wasn't sure if he imagined it. Rick sat down, letting his back sink into the grass. Morty joined him, shoulders brushing, as they watched the moons crawl across the sky. It wasn't silent. There was a hum, the subtle pulse of time itself napping, catching its breath before moving on. "Do you think," Morty began, "that somewhere else people are noticing us?" Rick smiled faintly, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Maybe. Maybe not. Doesn't change what we're doing right now." For hours they lay there. Morty listened to Rick's breathing, slow and steady, and felt the rhythm of a world that didn't hurry. It was a rare kind of calm, one that wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Eventually Rick's voice broke the quiet. "Remember this, Morty. Some places aren't about adventure. They're about being. Time needs naps, and so do we." Morty nodded, closing his eyes, letting the slow, endless stretch of golden grass and quiet moons lull him into a kind of peace that was almost impossible to find elsewhere. Jerry woke somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, a place where the floor felt too soft and the ceiling seemed impossibly high. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and ozone, like the memory of breakfast mixed with the smell of lightning. He wasn't sure how he got there. One moment he was in bed at home, and the next he stood in a wide hallway filled with doors of all shapes and sizes. Some were painted bright colours, others plain and unassuming. Every door had a small brass plate with no words, only tiny symbols that twinkled faintly, almost like constellations. A voice echoed behind him. It was Rick, though not the Rick he knew. This Rick was quieter, softer, almost contemplative. "Every door," the voice said, "leads to a story you almost forgot." Jerry stepped toward one of the doors and hesitated. He could hear faint laughter on the other side, like children playing in a place that didn't exist anywhere else. He opened it slowly. Inside, he saw himself, years younger, sitting on the living room floor with Morty building a small contraption. He watched the scene unfold without moving, realizing that this memory was alive, stretching and folding in ways he couldn't touch. Rick's voice came again. "You forget sometimes, Jerry. But the universe, it remembers in little pockets like this." Jerry closed the door gently, stepping back into the hallway. He felt lighter, though he didn't know why. Every door he passed whispered something faint, a hint of someone's laughter, a remembered word, a sigh that had almost been lost. When he finally woke for real, in his bed, the sunlight spilling through the curtains, he carried that quiet feeling with him. The strange dream hadn't solved anything, but it had reminded him of something small and important. Even forgotten moments could be held softly, tucked away, waiting to be noticed again. They drifted into a solar system that smelled faintly of salt and wet stone. The planet at its center was small, round, and covered in soft, mossy hills that glimmered under the first touch of the star's light. Rick didn't land immediately. He hovered the ship just above the surface, listening, and Morty realized slowly what he was hearing. A song. Not from speakers or machines, but from the planet itself. Low, humming tones rose and fell, like the breathing of the ground beneath them. "Every morning," Rick murmured, almost to himself, "this planet sings." No one asked it to. No one even notices it. And yet, it keeps singing. Morty tilted his head, letting the melody wash over him. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was the kind of music that made you feel something in the gaps between notes where you weren't supposed to understand fully. They walked barefoot on the soft moss, each step pressing into the song. Rick's hand hovered near the small instrument he always carried, a device to measure frequencies, though he rarely used it here. Morty could see the corners of Rick's mouth soften, almost imperceptibly, as if he too were listening for something he had lost long ago. At the crest of a hill, the sun rose fully, spilling warm light over them. Morty closed his eyes. The melody seemed to swell, not in volume but in presence, filling every empty corner of thought. For a moment he forgot the universe outside this hill, the dangers, the chaos, the things that never remembered him. Rick whispered, "Some things exist just to be beautiful, and that's enough." Morty nodded, letting the planet's song settle into his chest. He felt a gentle quiet he didn't know he'd needed. The universe could forget, he thought, but some songs always remembered themselves. Rick and Morty floated above a market that didn't appear on any map. It wasn't invisible in the usual sense. You could see it if you looked carefully, but it seemed to exist slightly out of sync with the rest of reality, like a dream barely anchored to the waking world. The stalls shimmered faintly, their shapes shifting when you tried to focus on them too hard. Vendors moved with careful, deliberate motions, offering items that seemed both familiar and impossibly strange. A fruit that tasted like the memory of your first smile, a jar of light that smelled faintly like rain, a small clock that ticked in reverse but never ran out of time. Morty wandered slowly, fingers brushing over goods that felt real but intangible. "Rick, how do we know this is safe?" Rick chuckled quietly, his voice unusually soft. "Safe isn't the point, Morty. Notice, experience, remember, that's the point." A vendor offered them a tiny, glowing cube. Morty reached out, and when he touched it, he felt a wave of something like nostalgia. Not for a place he'd been, but for a feeling he hadn't known he'd missed. Rick didn't take the cube. He just watched Morty with a faint, approving smile. They walked through the market in silence, each step leaving a faint shimmer in the air that quickly faded. The hum of unseen conversations, the gentle clinking of curious items, it all seemed designed to remind travelers that some places exist, not for utility or profit, but for quiet wonder. When they left, the market vanished as suddenly as it appeared. Morty turned to Rick. "Will it be there tomorrow?" Rick shook his head. "Tomorrow's a different story, Morty. Some places are meant to be found once, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough." They drifted above a world where the sky was soft grey, and the clouds hung heavy and low like wool stretched across a distant horizon. Rick guided the ship gently, careful not to disturb the delicate patterns floating above. "See that one?" Rick asked, pointing to a large, dark cloud hovering just above the surface. "That's a memory cloud." Morty squinted. "Memory? Cloud?" Rick nodded. "It collects the things people forget. Secrets, promises, old laughter, regrets. Stuff that slips through the cracks." Morty felt a chill, but it wasn't unpleasant. The cloud seemed alive, pulsing gently as if breathing. Tiny glimmers floated through it, like fragments of starlight trapped in mist. "Can we touch it?" Morty asked hesitantly. Rick shook his head. "Number, you can't hold a memory without changing it. The point is to see it, not keep it." They hovered there in silence. Morty watched as a small silver shimmer drifted from the cloud, fading into the air. Rick's hand hovered near the controls, but he didn't move. "Why are we here?" Morty finally asked. Rick didn't answer immediately. He let the cloud drift between them and the planet below. Sometimes it's important to remember that not everything lost is gone. Some things just wait, quietly, until someone notices again. Morty nodded slowly, understanding more than he could explain. They left the cloud behind, drifting onward through the soft grey sky. Yet in his mind the image stayed, the dark cloud full of secrets pulsing gently, waiting patiently for someone to see. They came upon a star that pulsed faintly, not with the fiery intensity of others, but with a quiet, almost hesitant glow. Rick slowed the ship, letting it drift near, and Morty noticed something unusual. The star seemed to sway, as if it were breathing or dreaming. "Why does it look lonely?" Morty asked softly. Rick didn't answer at first. He stared, eyes tracing the uneven glow. "Not all stars are meant to shine brightly for everyone," he said finally. "Some exist just to keep their own rhythm, to hold their own stories, even if no one else notices." Morty thought about it for a long moment. He realized it reminded him of Rick sometimes, wandering through universes, leaving traces that only he could see or understand. The star's light shifted, faint pulses moving like waves across its surface. Morty imagined it thinking in slow, patient thoughts, dreams that stretched across time and space, memories of worlds it had touched in ways no one could measure. Rick reached over and patted Morty's shoulder. "It's okay to be unnoticed, Morty. Some things are valuable, even if no one's keeping score." For a while, they drifted beside the quiet star, neither speaking. The hum of the ship's engines blended with the soft pulse of the star, a lullaby for travelers who had seen too much, yet still found wonder in the gentle rhythm of the universe. When they finally pulled away, the star remained, dreaming alone, a faint glow in the vast darkness, quietly reminding them both that even solitude could hold beauty. They arrived at a planet that seemed to rest as if it were breathing slowly, stretched out on its back beneath a violet sky. Mountains rolled gently like limbs, and rivers curved lazily across valleys that seemed to yawn at the horizon. Rick parked the ship on a gentle slope, and Morty stepped out, feeling the soft ground yield beneath his boots. The air smelled faintly of honey and moss, a quiet sweetness that filled the lungs without effort. "Everything here moves slowly," Morty whispered, watching a lake ripple in time with some secret rhythm. Rick nodded. "This planet doesn't hurry, doesn't rush, doesn't care what anyone thinks. It just is. There's wisdom in that, Morty, even if you can't always see it." They wandered across the hills, leaving light footprints that vanished as soon as they pressed the moss. Birds with feathers like glass glided overhead, their wings making faint, bell-like sounds. Morty paused to listen, feeling the steady heartbeat of a world at rest. Rick leaned against a gentle rise, gazing at the horizon. "Sometimes the universe forgets us. Sometimes we forget ourselves. Places like this remind us that it's okay to just lie back and breathe." Morty sat down beside him, letting the soft ground cradle him. They watched clouds fold and unfold, rivers curve endlessly, and the planet's slow, quiet movements teach them a lesson that didn't need words. By the time they returned to the ship, Morty felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't noticed had been lifted. The planet lay behind them, still resting, still dreaming, still teaching in silence that even in forgetting, there is peace. They landed near a canyon that seemed carved from shadows, its walls deep and smooth, glowing faintly in the light of two distant suns. A soft wind moved through the rock formations, carrying sounds that made Morty's hair lift ever so slightly, like a memory brushing against his skin. "Why is it called the Whispering Canyon?" Morty asked, stepping closer to the edge. Rick didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, eyes tracing the faint echoes that swirled like smoke in the air. "Listen," he said finally. Morty tilted his head, and the canyon spoke. Not in words exactly, but in tones and sighs, faint echoes that felt like half-forgotten dreams. It whispered of places Rick had been, people he had known, and moments that slipped away without anyone noticing. "You hear that?" Rick murmured. "The canyon remembers. Not me. Not anyone. Just remembers." Morty nodded slowly. He could hear laughter, faint and distant, the way it might sound if you remembered it wrong. He could hear sadness too, but soft, folded into the stone itself. They walked along the canyon's edge, careful not to step too close. Each footfall seemed to stir a new whisper, stories folding into other stories, moments lost and found in the curves of the rock. Rick finally spoke again. "Sometimes the universe doesn't need us to hold everything. Sometimes it just needs someone to notice, even for a moment. That's enough." Morty leaned against Rick, listening. The wind moved through the canyon, carrying secrets and memories that weren't theirs, yet felt intimate all the same. And for a while, neither of them spoke, letting the canyon's gentle whispers wrap around them like a quiet lullaby. They arrived above a planet where gardens floated in the sky, tethered by thin silver vines that swayed lazily in a wind Morty couldn't feel. Flowers glimmered with colours he didn't have names for, petals folding and unfolding in slow, deliberate patterns. Rick guided the ship between the floating gardens, careful not to brush against the delicate vines. "These gardens," he said softly, "exist because someone believed in beauty. Not for profit, not for utility, just because it could exist." Morty leaned against the observation window, watching a small cluster of flowers that seemed to bloom just as they rotated toward the sun. Their glow reflected faintly on the glass, filling the cockpit with gentle, shifting colours. Rick reached over and adjusted the ship's thrusters slightly, making a small, quiet course correction. "Everything here moves at its own pace. Flowers, vines, gravity. You follow your rhythm, Morty. Doesn't have to match anyone else's." Morty imagined stepping onto one of the floating platforms, feeling the soft petals beneath his feet, each step producing a faint melodic hum. The thought made him smile softly. They stayed for a while, drifting through the floating clusters, neither speaking much. When they finally left, the gardens hung behind them like a fading dream, beautiful and untouched. Morty realized that sometimes the most profound experiences didn't need words. Rick smirked faintly as he set the ship on course again. "Remember this one, Morty. Some things exist just to remind us there's still wonder. That's enough to keep moving." Morty nodded quietly, letting the gentle beauty of the floating gardens settle into his chest, a memory he could carry wherever they went next. They descended toward a lake that shimmered with shifting colors, as if each ripple reflected a different mood of the world. The surface moved slowly, hypnotically, painting blues and golds and quiet purples that seemed impossible to name. Morty leaned on the ship's railing, mesmerized. "It's alive, isn't it?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He watched the lake in silence, eyes tracing patterns that moved too slowly to understand fully. "Not alive, not like you or me, but it's aware in its own way. It remembers, it dreams." The air smelled faintly of rain, and something else Morty couldn't identify, a soft warmth that pressed gently against his chest. He felt as though he could step into the lake and float in a memory that wasn't his, yet somehow familiar. Rick handed him a small round stone. "Drop it," he said quietly. Morty obeyed. The stone hit the water, sending ripples across the lake. Each ripple changed the colors subtly, weaving new shades into the dream of the lake. They notice us," Morty whispered, almost afraid to speak too loudly. Rick nodded. "Everything notices, Morty." even the quiet things, even the things that don't speak. You just have to be patient enough to see it. They stayed until the sun began to set, casting long streaks of light that mingled with the lake's colours. Morty closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the slow, endless shimmer fill his thoughts. When they finally left, the lake lingered in his mind, a soft memory of a world that dreamed quietly and beautifully all on its own. They arrived on a planet where trees stretched high into a pale lavender sky, their branches weaving into shapes that seemed almost like hands reaching out to one another. The forest was quiet, but not silent. Every step stirred faint echoes that lingered long after the sound had passed. Morty wandered slowly among the trees, listening. The echoes weren't voices exactly, but snippets of laughter, sighs, and small conversations that seemed to belong to no one in particular. "It's like the forest remembers people," he whispered. Rick nodded. "Some places hold pieces of everything that passes through. Memories, thoughts, quiet feelings, echoes. Not all of it makes sense, but it's all there, floating around, waiting to be noticed." A breeze moved through the branches, carrying a scent of warm earth and rain. Morty reached out and touched the bark of one tree. It was rough and strong, yet it vibrated faintly under his fingers, like a heartbeat in slow rhythm. Rick followed quietly, adjusting a small device that hummed softly in his hand. "Don't try to take it with you," he said. "The forest won't work that way. You can only let it touch you. That's enough." Morty nodded, closing his eyes. For a long time they walked among the trees, letting the echoes wash over them. Each sound felt like a story, a memory, a fragment of someone else's life. And yet, somehow, it all felt connected to them. When they finally left the forest, the echoes lingered in Morty's mind. He understood quietly that the forest didn't need him to remember it. It just needed someone to hear for a little while, and that was enough to keep its stories alive. They drifted toward a bridge suspended in space, its surface made of light and shadows, stretching endlessly between two clusters of faintly glowing stars. Each step seemed to hum softly, as if the bridge itself remembered the weight of every traveller who had ever crossed it. Morty paused at the edge. "Where does it go?" Rick didn't answer at once. He walked beside him, careful with each step. Somewhere it needs to go, or maybe nowhere. Doesn't matter. The journey itself is the point. The stars beneath them flickered like tiny whispers, fading and returning as though caught between memory and forgetfulness. Morty reached out his hand, and the light rippled beneath his fingers, warm and soft, a sensation that felt impossible to explain. "Why does it feel familiar?" Morty asked. Rick's eyes softened, a rare gentleness in his expression. "Because everything we forget has a way of finding us again, Morty. Even stars, even bridges, even us." They walked slowly, letting the bridge carry them across the dark expanse. There was no hurry, no urgency, just the quiet pulse of light and the subtle hum beneath their feet. Morty glanced back at the fading stars they had passed. "Do you think anyone will remember them?" Rick shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't change the fact that they existed. That's enough." By the time they reached the other side, the bridge had vanished behind them, leaving only the vastness of space. And for the first time that night, Morty understood something quietly comforting. Even when things fade, the journey itself holds its own memory. They descended into a valley bathed in a gentle golden light that seemed to hover just above the ground. The air was warm, not oppressive, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and honeyed grass. Every shadow stretched lazily, as if the land itself had settled in for a long nap. Morty walked slowly, letting his fingers brush the tall grasses. "It's peaceful here," he whispered. Rick nodded, letting the quiet wash over him. "Some places exist just to remind us that stillness is important. Not everything needs noise or motion. Some worlds just sleep in their light." A soft wind moved through the valley, bending the flowers and tall stalks in gentle waves. Morty closed his eyes, feeling the warmth settle in his chest, the same calm he had felt on other quiet worlds, only multiplied. Rick sat on a small rise, watching the valley stretch into the distance. We forget how rare this is, Morty. Time moves fast. Universes spin endlessly. But places like this, they exist to remind us to pause, to breathe, to notice. Morty crouched beside a small stream reflecting the golden light. He dipped his fingers into the water, watching the ripples spread slowly, intentionally. Even the water seemed to respect the valley's quiet pace. They stayed until the sun, or the star overhead, Morty wasn't sure, sank low, casting a long, soft glow that filled the valley with colour and warmth. As they left, the valley seemed to exhale, sending a final wave of light over them, a quiet reminder that even in movement, some places stay with you forever. Rick and Morty drifted quietly through the emptiness between stars, a silence so deep it felt alive. Around them galaxies turned lazily, and nebulae stretched like faint watercolour strokes across the void. Everything was still, yet nothing felt empty. Morty leaned against the side of the ship, speaking softly. "Do you think the universe ever remembers us?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He let the ship drift, letting the silence carry the question like a feather. Then he spoke, his voice low and calm. "The universe doesn't need to remember us, Morty. It whispers back in its own way, in light, in colour, in places that wait quietly for someone to notice." They passed a small cluster of stars, their faint glow rippling gently, as if nodding in acknowledgement. Morty realized that everything they had seen, the singing planets, the dreaming lakes, the floating gardens, was a kind of memory, held softly, like a story tucked in a pocket. Rick reached over and patted Morty's shoulder. "We don't have to do anything grand, just notice, just be. That's enough." Morty closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the stars and the hum of the ship fill him. He felt the gentle rhythm of time, not rushing, not demanding, just moving in its own quiet way. Rick leaned back, gazing through the windshield. Somewhere out there, everything we've seen, everything we've touched, it's still waiting, waiting quietly, waiting for someone who cares, even a little. The ship drifted on. Nebulae swirled around them, galaxies twirled slowly, and for a long moment there was only the soft pulse of existence itself. And somewhere, Rick, Morty, and the quiet universe they'd touched were all part of a story that didn't need telling, only remembering, and with that, he stretched into the stars,